and welcome everybody. Thank you so very much for joining us this beautiful afternoon for our session on securing the world's open source software together. We have the amazing privilege of being spoken to with Mike Hanley. He is the Chief Security Officer and SVP of Engineering for GitHub. So please, a round of applause for our session today.
All right. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everybody for being here today. And how's the conference going so far? Was lunch good today? Awesome. All right, good. Well, hopefully everybody's well fed. We'll have a good conversation about open source security today. So as I was introduced, I'm Mike Hanley. I'm the Chief Security Officer and the Senior Vice President of Engineering at GitHub. And it's great to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit more about the team effort that it's going to take, really from all of us, from the communities we're a part of, and the companies that we work for, to secure open source. Now, before I get into that, let me set a little bit of context after the required legal disclaimer slide that you've seen a couple times probably during the conference so far. And I'll start by just saying, and I hope we can all agree with this, the world runs on software. It has successfully eaten the world at this point, if you've heard that famous quote. And we find that 97% of all software projects include some amount of open source software. And if you look back at just what we saw in calendar year 2022, there were more than 413 million contributions to open source projects on github.com. And about 90% of organizations tell us that they're incorporating some amount of open source software into their projects and products. And really, whether it's the alarm clock that woke you up this morning, or maybe it was the Tesla that drove you here, or your refrigerator reminding you that it's time to change the filter, all of those experiences are powered in some way by open source software, most of which has probably been built by communities that are on github.com. But with open source growing, and obviously the proliferation of that, invariably you're going to have growth in the complexity, severity, and number of vulnerabilities that occur in open source code as well, and certainly the impact that follows from that. And you don't have to actually look that far back in recent memory to remember who remembers the log4j, log4shell. I hope all the hands go up for that. And that was really probably one of the largest and most significant vulnerabilities that we saw in a major open source project any time in the last several years. And I knew this was mainstream when my mom called me and said, "Did you hear about that thing that's going on with Minecraft?" So we're sort of officially making it as a mainstream topic now at this point. But that's just really one example of the broad impact that vulnerabilities in open source, again, that's ubiquitous really in everything that we use, has, and why this is such an important challenge for us to really work together to get after. And with more than 100 million developers working on GitHub today, we know that with so much of the world's development happening on GitHub, that security is not just an opportunity for us to have an impact, it's really actually a vital responsibility for us as a platform. But in the spirit of open source, this isn't something that we're just going to solve on our own. And I would say, frankly, that I don't think that there's any one party that can fix or solve open source security on their own. And I think that this is really because securing open source is a team sport. And everybody, whether you're a consumer of open source, you're using it, incorporating it into your project, or you're a contributor and a maintainer to open source, you're building the next thing that people will incorporate into their products and services, we've all got a part to play in helping make sure that the broader ecosystem is secure. Developers, businesses, governments, and more. And what we believe at GitHub, and what I personally believe, is the best place to have that impact, and the place where we've got to focus the vast majority of our energy, is really on actually empowering the developers who are creating that open source software and code that we all depend on. There's lots and lots and lots of fancy things that we can do in security. You've probably seen some of the cool stuff on the show floor today, but if we don't get empowering developers right who are actually creating that open source that we depend on, very little of what else we can do is going to matter. So today I really want to spend the rest of our time talking about some of the practical ways that you or your company or teams that you're a part of or communities that you participate in can actually help move the needle on securing open source, and again, really through focusing on empowering and helping and supporting the developers who are building that. So first I want to talk a little bit about education. And to set a little bit of framing and grounding, hopefully we can all agree with this, but there is absolutely a scarcity of knowledge, expertise, and talent in the security space. And as a practical matter, we also know that for about every 100 developers, there's really only about one security professional to correspond to those. And what that means is that developers, particularly those who are working in open source, don't necessarily have like the standby security team available that a lot of us probably have in our day jobs, let alone necessarily security expertise within their project. And if you've contributed in open source communities, you know that a lot of cases what's actually bringing people to those communities is they're there to create. And while they care about security, they might not necessarily have that particular discipline or background. So really to think about how we help with this and how we make it easier for developers to get more secure, one of the approaches there ends up being we want to marry a lot of the good training and education out there with good experiences for tooling that are built with the developer in mind. Now, inside GitHub, we operate something called the GitHub Security Lab, and this is a team of full-time security researchers who are on staff at GitHub. I would say they probably have one of the coolest jobs at GitHub because they're fully focused on helping the open source creator communities that are out there on GitHub working on, again, the projects that we all use and depend on, do a better job with security. And that can be through some of the more traditional work like knowledge and training and making some of that content available. But they also actually go out and actually like sit down with some of those projects and partner with them and lend a hand. Their work is going to cover everything from like helping make sure those tools get adopted to doing things like code audits. Now, to give you one example of some of the resources that they provide which go beyond sort of your traditional training and tooling, that team maintains something called the GitHub Security Advisory Database. If some of you have seen that before, it's become a really important asset in the broader open source community. And this is a pretty crucial, like central vulnerability management capability for the broader open source community in the sense that it's free, so we make it available to anybody to consume it, so anybody can use that. But it's also open for community contribution, so if people have things to add to enhance the information or the richness of context that's in a security vulnerability, they, much like any other piece of open source, can open a pull request and contribute back to that. And we also see that not only is this getting used sort of more broadly as a source of knowledge, but some language communities like Go and Rust have actually made this the single source of truth for security bulletins for their entire ecosystems, which is great. And in addition to the advisory database, there's actually a lot of other free tooling and capability that's available out there. And I'll just give you a few examples, things like code scanning, which is powered by CodeQL, secret scanning capabilities, Dependabot at GitHub. All of those are very much built with how do you actually help a developer be more securely in the context and flow of what they're trying to do. And the good news is that these are all things that actually GitHub makes available for free for open source developers working in public repositories. And the benefit of these is really that all these tools are meant to help surface information that's actionable to maintainers about alerts or things that they need to resolve in their project in ways that are easy to interact with. Now, while each of those is developed with the developer in mind, the actual experience also is in the tools that they know and love. So if you're already on GitHub building your project because that's where it lives, and you're getting information in things like GitHub pull requests, that's a great place to actually be able to interact with and set those developers up for success from an alerting standpoint. And the good news is that developers are actually giving us the feedback that this is working. And this shows up both in qualitative feedback and in quantitative feedback. So we can look and say that actually 50% more vulnerable packages were updated in 2022 through Dependabot alerts than in 2021. And the breadth of that impact meant that we helped get over 18 million unique packages updated. Now, the more we bring knowledge and tooling together, the better outcomes that I think we'll be able to help deliver for developers everywhere. If you look back at, again, the recent example I brought up, which is Log4j, this is a pretty interesting and complex example where knowledge and tooling came together to help empower developers. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways it did that. Now, if you're familiar with and remember Log4j, the bug is actually about 10 years old today, roughly. So this was introduced back in 2013. And like a lot of software vulnerabilities, we know that in many cases they can remain latent and undiscovered for months or years. And Log4j is actually a great example where at Black Hat in 2016, a security researcher who's actually part of the team at GitHub, gave a talk conceptually on what that class of vulnerability would look like. But it didn't actually surface and bite us until 2021, where, if you remember, it basically set the broader Java ecosystem on fire. And what was cool was that within a few minutes of that initial disclosure, and I don't know how many of you were working an incident response shift that night, but it was an exciting evening. But within the first few minutes of that initial disclosure, the GitHub Security Lab actually published the security advisory through the security advisory database that I mentioned a minute ago to start the process of actually alerting the broader open source community that there was a problem, and specifically that they had that particular dependency that needed to be updated in their project. And this actually kicked off several 100,000 alerts through Dependabot to more than 375,000 open source projects and repositories to let them know that they needed to do something. And an advantage of acting so quickly and trying to get that information in the hands of maintainers was that within 1 week, about half of those active repositories had already merged a fix. And this is actually pretty good response time for a broader open source community. Now that's the reactive work that was happening to get the word out and get a fix in place, but the community was also working together on proactive measures to make sure that we could find variants of the bug and that the bug wouldn't reoccur in the future. So security researchers and members of the broader community were writing things like CodeQL queries to help us detect variations of the bug, but also the source project at the Apache Software Foundation turned on code scanning to help make sure that the bug wouldn't reappear in the project in the future, which is also great. And I can't actually think of a better recent example where that collaboration between tooling, knowledge, community awareness, and collaboration led to a better outcome of what otherwise could have been, I think, a much more catastrophic event at wide scale. I also think you probably heard a lot about AI this week, and you'll hear it again now, but I also think AI is fundamentally going to transform how we think about security experiences for developers. And hopefully some of you have had a chance to see something like GitHub Copilot, but how many of you have maybe heard that we're shifting security left before? I mean, we've been saying that for quite some time. Well, left used to mean that we were interacting with you in like a CI/CD context, right? So at the time you're running tests, that's where you're getting security feedback. Well, there's actually a much more dramatic shift left that's happened, or that's happening now with AI, and it's actually that through experiences like Copilot and some of the LLMs that are available today, we're actually able to help give you good security feedback and help create better security experiences at the moment that you're bringing an idea to code in the editor. There's really not anywhere further left that we can go than that, and I think that's actually going to have a pretty transformative impact on how we think about security for developers going forward. Now, the nice thing is, not only is this helping with better security outcomes, but you also have AI-powered tools that are helping with productivity outcomes. So we see a lot of developers that, roughly half of the code that they're committing is coming from Copilot as their AI pair programmer. But they're also telling us that they're much happier using tools like that. They feel better. So how often do you get to have a tool that gets you better productivity outcomes, better security outcomes, and happier developers? And this is a really good and exciting new front for us, and it's early days on that front, but I think this is all good news for helping empower developers going forward, particularly in working in or around open source. Now, I want to look at a little bit more about how we can support developers in the software supply chain. So your software project depends on someone else's project, which depends on someone else's project, which also depends on someone else's project. And so I think you get where I'm going with this. It's the supply chain. And really what you end up with is you end up with the complexity of really a graph problem here, right? And this is one of the things that makes dependency management and supply chain security so hard, is that very few things are sort of fully original work in the sense that you're incorporating somebody else's code, and thereby you're also incorporating any dependencies that they have and any sort of security hygiene pieces that are associated with that. And what this means is basically everybody else's problem to some degree becomes your problem, given the interwoven dependencies that we've got in the ecosystem. And I think that this is going to mean, especially for the big consumers of open source software, so like the big businesses, the large enterprise, the large software shops, they've got to help give back more to help solve this problem in the form of resources that will actually help set those developers up for success. And there's really 3 ways that I think about that resourcing showing up. And I think it shows up in the form of time, meaning giving of one's time or the time of your team or your company to help support that. It's the expertise, which again in a private sector context is often sort of buttoned up in the shops that have the most resources or willingness to pay for things like talent. And then also funding to more directly sort of financially support some of those projects that they depend on. And that's important because we know that like the knowledge and the training and some of the free tooling by itself is not going to get us where we need to go. And I believe that most of those resources really need to be directed at helping developers to be brilliant at the basics. If you've seen the Forrester hierarchy of pyramid of need, Forrester's targeted attack hierarchy of needs, this has been around since about 2014. I still think it's a good reference point today. But when you look at the top of the pyramid here, this is where a lot of the flashy stuff is happening in security. And you can probably go down to the show floor and pick out some examples of this. And it's not to say that there's not good work happening there. What's to say is, unfortunately, a lot of organizations prioritize that work over the basics and the fundamentals that give you a strong foundation closer to the bottom of the pyramid. I'll give you an example of what that looks like in practice. If you go out and you buy like exotic night vision, motion detecting, facial recognition cameras on your house so that you'll know exactly who broke in at what time through what entrance and you'll be able to positively identify them in real time, but you didn't spend $10 on putting deadbolts on the door, that's probably a disordered security investment. And unfortunately, this is a pervasive problem in the broader security industry. So helping the developers get the foundational pieces of this right and really having an emphasis on those durable things that create like repeatable and reliable good security outcomes in open source projects and in teams that are using open source is super critical. And when I think about like the fundamentals, this is a place where platforms like GitHub, I think, have a unique opportunity to have a big impact more broadly, especially as the home of open source developers. And for us, that's meant actually an emphasis on helping get those fundamentals right in places like multi-factor authentication for developers, because we see that this actually has huge impact throughout the rest of the software supply chain. Now, we've been talking about two-factor authentication forever. It's not new technology, yet in 2023, we still need to tell people on a regular basis that you need to do this. And I don't think that despite things like Zero Trust being fairly mainstream concepts at this point, I also don't think you need to look very hard to find that not a lot of organizations have fully embraced two-factor authentication, let alone strong authentication in the form of sort of the latest and greatest technologies, like I'm thinking WebAuthn or passkeys, et cetera. And you can see some of the comparison data points of, I think it was this last year, Twitter published some transparency data suggesting that about a little over 2.5% of their end users use some kind of two-factor authentication. And even last year on GitHub.com, we found that among active users, slightly less than 20% of them used two-factor authentication. And again, this is a control we talk about all the time. That's an essential item. The impact of driving up that adoption for the ecosystem is massive when you think about the negative consequences associated with the account of a developer who has access to a project that lots of people depend on being compromised. And actually, this was the impetus for us starting some of the work in this space, because we also own the NPM registry. And back at the end of 2021, we actually saw exactly that happening. We saw a number of high-profile accounts associated with package publishers for packages that got very large reach being compromised, and then malicious packages being published. And that's a real threat to everybody who depends on consuming those packages. So the best control that we could put in place to effectively substantially raise the cost of successful account takeover was requiring MFA adoption across the entire NPM registry. I'm happy to say that we're done with that, and that's largely extinguished that as an attack vector. And we've learned enough from that that early last year we announced that we were going to continue that work on GitHub.com and require everybody who contributes code on GitHub.com to use some form of two-factor authentication. And I'm happy to tell you that we're already a few cohorts into this in terms of driving the numbers up, and we're seeing a lot of really great success, and I do believe that we'll meet our goal of making sure that all code contributors on github.com will be required to use some form of MFA on GitHub by the end of this calendar year. Now, I think that making it easier for developers to be secure in the work of being with their communities and doing development of open source project is probably one of the biggest things that GitHub can do in particular to help secure the broader open source ecosystem. And my hope is that some of the other platforms and players in the space will actually follow suit and do the same, because I think this is that important to making sure that the broader software ecosystem benefits from that. Now, 2FA is a basic thing. We're going to make sure that we get that right. But there's also a lot of other places where companies in particular can give back and contribute to the basics and the fundamentals and improving security hygiene and posture for the broader open source community. And there's probably 3 ways that when you leave here, you can go back to your teams and contribute that I want to leave you with. First, if your company's security team finds a vulnerability in an open source dependency, and I'm sure this has happened numerous times to many of you who are out there, don't just fork it and fix it for you. Find a way to responsibly contribute that fix and disclose that bug back upstream to the project that you depend on. I think this is a good thing to do because you're helping the project maintainers, clearly, and you're giving back to that project that you benefit so much from. But also, odds are some other vendor that you depend on is also using that same package or project as part of their code, and you will want them to benefit from the same fix that you just found and implemented. So giving back, contributing back upstream when you've got a security enhancement or a fix to the project, I think is actually a really, really important way to give back as a consumer of open source. Second, there's other ways to contribute to other sort of ecosystem work, like, for example, the internet bug bounty. And we all know that, like a traditional bug bounty, you're largely incentivizing vulnerability discovery, right? I mean, GitHub has a large bug bounty. It's all about incentivizing and rewarding people finding bugs in GitHub's code. But the nice thing about the internet bug bounty is the internet bug bounty also incentivizes people fixing those bugs. So you're actually incentivizing the defenders or the people who are actually going to go out and do the work to fix those vulnerabilities just as much as you are rewarding vulnerability discovery, which is great, and I think encourages some of that healthy balance on where we need to be focused. And then finally, you can also directly sponsor, and again, meaning this in the sense of financial support, open source projects that you depend on. And this is actually why in 2019 at GitHub, we created the GitHub Sponsors Program. And that's actually letting businesses and individuals directly provide financial support to the projects they depend on, which in turn will help them spend more time maintaining, supporting, and enhancing the projects that you depend on and that they build and you love. And I'm happy to say that actually, as of this year, we've already seen more than $32 million given globally across 13,000 projects by individuals and companies. And if you regularly benefit from any open source projects, I would definitely encourage you to think about getting involved in this way and helping out some of those projects that you depend on. I mean, really, open source software is so core and critical to everything that we build, use, and do. I think these 3 types of actions of being a responsible consumer and giving back to the broader ecosystem are things that we can all really benefit substantially from. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about collaboration and sort of working together across the broader community beyond individuals and businesses, because we know that we have key partners in places like government that have an important role in helping empower developers to build more secure open source software. And securing open source, I think, is fundamentally going to require that we've got that strong global collaboration to get after this on a number of facets, right? It's not just fixing bugs, it's not just sending a check. It's the financial pieces, the technical pieces, the policy pieces of this that are all going to come together to a more holistic solution. And in part because we also know that open source defects and attacks don't know any geographic or political boundaries. So really getting global governments involved is going to be so critical to this. And I think about some of the impact there in 3 ways, sort of the 3 Ps of this, if you will. It's policy, right? So getting good policy, good regulation about how to think about using open source, the places where regulation makes sense, where can the government get involved, what are the expectations that we want people to have. There's the partnership, so actually the public sector and the private sector actually working together and in harmony, not against one another, to drive better outcomes here and recognizing the strengths of the different players there. And then third is the participation. Like, how do you actually mobilize people to get involved and contribute? Because sometimes it's important to have a little bit of a bootstrapping on knowing where to start. And governments have such a unique role, in part because they have some of those unique authorities to be top-down in a regulatory sense. But it's not just the policy pieces or regulation or legislation that matters. It's also the actions that government can take in the form of things like buying. Now, like the US government, as an example, is probably the world's single largest buyer of software and IT systems. And the rules that they follow through things like federal acquisition regulations, where they sometimes specify expectations of software, those can have a really, really powerful impact on actually moving the needle for how software is built, and in particular, incentivizing working back to actually help support the open source software that's incorporated into that. Now, early in 2022, I had the opportunity to join several other colleagues from public and private sector at the White House Open Source Security Summit. And what was encouraging to me was that this was in response to Log4j, but that meeting was not just a photo opportunity in a press conference where we all got together, talked about security for a little bit, and then everybody went their separate ways. This actually led to, I feel, a meaningful change in the dialogue between public and private sector, and much more frequent and substantive conversations that are happening, not just among the private sector entities, but with our counterparts in the public sector, to work together with our unique strengths to actually make progress in this space. We actually sat down, had some of the substantive conversations, have made some of the meaningful follow-ups. And a good example of some of that follow-up that I think has been a meaningful step forward is actually the Open Source Security Foundation's mobilization plan. And if you've seen this, it was published back in May of last year. And the mobilization plan is basically the product of experts in the private and public sector on policy, on technical standards, business decision makers, on where do we think actually the most meaningful and important points of leverage are in open source software, so that we can help people surge against those. And if you're looking for a place to get started in contributing to open source security, I would absolutely go take a look at this plan and look at these 10 work streams, because this largely maps to sort of the 10 biggest categories of problems where we need to come together as a broader team to help developers be successful with open source security. I'm going to give you a firsthand example of where some of that work actually shows up in practice. One of those 10 work streams is on securing repositories, and GitHub is actively involved with the SigStore project, Linux Foundation, Open Source Security Foundation, and other entities to help really drive SigStore adoption, in part in response to the grassroots efforts that we see in the community. And if you don't know what SigStore is, I'll give you kind of a brief analogy to explain this. I know we just had lunchtime, so I'll give you a food example. If there were a piece of pizza sitting out in the hallway here at Moscone, would you pick it up and eat it? I see most people shaking their head no, and hopefully that's not just because you're well fed after lunch here. But you probably would not pick it up and eat it, right? I mean, how long was it there? Who made it? What went into it? A lot of people have been on the floor, walking on the floor here. You just don't really know what you're getting yourself into if you pick up that piece of pizza and eat it. And SigStore is sort of addressing the analog to that problem in the software security space, which is it's helping you actually get some attestation as to where did this software come from? Who made it? How can I trace this back to source code that I can go look at and reason about and make a more informed decision on? And it's backed by trustworthy infrastructure run in partnership between public and private sector entities that are participating in that. And I think this is great. It's great for consumers of open source, right? Because it gives them those artifacts to help them go back to what's the code that I'm actually incorporating? But it's also helpful in empowering developers because it allows them to volunteer some of those artifacts to the consumers to help basically get access to the ability to be incorporated into some of those, or to provide some additional information to consumers who otherwise might not be willing or able to consume their software without that. And NPM is actually the first registry to publicly support that, so we made that announcement last week, and we're really excited about that. We're also working with other registries through that securing repos workstream to help them actually also adopt this. And I think the impact of this is huge, and we've already seen big projects that are powering global infrastructure like Kubernetes adopt SigStore. So I'm excited to sort of see where this goes in terms of helping developers produce those helpful artifacts and security attestations that I think are going to be really important to supply chain security going forward. Now, there's other good policy items also coming out of the government, and you probably have seen in the last few months the White House National Cybersecurity Strategy. And if you haven't read this, I definitely would encourage you. There's a great summary on the White House website, but there's really two key takeaways that I think are relevant here to helping to secure open source software and helping developers to do that work. The first one is the strategy basically says the platform providers and the players in the ecosystem that are in the best position to make a difference from a security standpoint should do so. And I would agree with this. I think this is actually really good guidance, right? And you don't have to look very far to see that this is exactly why we've made some of the decisions that we made at GitHub, like giving away security tooling for free to projects that live in public repos on github.com, or driving things like multi-factor authentication across all code contributors on github.com. Nobody's telling us to do that. It's just the right thing to do, and it's a good example of where a platform can help drive a better security outcome across the board. And I hope that we'll see even more of that going forward. The second example of that is the second example from the White House strategy that I really liked is the White House strategy basically says the software producers need to bear more of the liability and responsibility and consequences for software vulnerabilities and security breaches that stem from them. And I think this is also a good change because I think we can all agree anytime there's a major security vulnerability or some kind of defect, the consequences of that typically roll all the way down the hill until they clobber the consumer at the end of that. So it'll be good to see us spread some of the load and responsibility for that more. And really, businesses that are in positions generally to do more to help with security have absolutely got to be doing so going forward, especially when it comes to partnering with and supporting those open source communities that they're so dependent on as part of building their software and services. Now, if you're not a policymaker in the room or you don't have access to some of the policymakers who are making some of those decisions with government, that's okay. And actually, there are probably a lot of different ways that when you walk out of this room today, you can actively get involved and participate in helping improve the state of open source security. And just to give you a couple examples, like hopefully if you're in this room, you've got at least a couple open source projects that you're familiar with, you've heard of, you've previously contributed to, or that you know your company or your team actively depends on, or maybe that you can contribute to on a day-to-day basis. Go take a look at those projects. There's probably security enhancements or issues that are tagged as good first issues. There's ways to get involved and contribute directly by jumping in and lending a hand. So that's something you can walk out of the room and do today. There's also tons and tons of free knowledge, content, and training available from GitHub, from OpenSSF, from a lot of the other vendors and entities. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of that stuff, send it to your friends, make sure that people know and have access to it. I think knowledge is such a critical piece of helping us move forward. Make sure that you've also adopted some of the free tools that are available out there. The free tools don't make an impact if people don't actually turn them on and use them. So if you're contributing to or part of an open source project that lives on GitHub today, I would definitely challenge you to go flip the bit and turn on secret scanning when you leave the room. It's literally just a couple clicks in the repo, and that'll help you deflect one of the leading causes of security incidents today, which is like hard-coded credentials and secrets in code. So that's something you can do today that costs nothing for an open source project. And then also go sponsor a project that you depend on. And like for me personally, one of the projects that I sponsor that I depend on and use every day is Homebrew. And I know a lot of the maintainers, they're doing great work. They're very giving of a lot of their time, and they're powering a lot of the, the missing macOS package manager for many, probably hundreds of thousands of consumers of that. And again, it takes just a few clicks, and it's an opportunity to contribute back to and support the work of those developer communities that we depend on. Longer term, if you're thinking about something more strategic from an investment perspective, your security team, I mentioned earlier, probably has some forked fixes off of open source dependencies that you have. And of course, you can contribute those back upstream. But you can also do a hack week with some of your favorite open source projects. Or for professional development time, ask your manager if you can go volunteer with an open source project or community that you want to get involved in. Basically bringing your time and talents to actually go help those projects that you benefit from so much. I'd also encourage, if your company's not a part of the OpenSSF, I would definitely encourage you to take a look. Full disclosure, I'm one of the governing board members for the Open Source Security Foundation, but I think it's a really important forum to facilitate experts from the private sector coming together to coordinate our efforts on some of these projects. Again, it's not going to be any one individual company, team, or person that solves this alone. It's really going to be a team sport, and OpenSSF is a great coordinating way to get involved. You can also take a look at the open source mobilization plan. Again, look at those 10 work streams, find some that are important to you that you feel like you can contribute, and get started there. You can also write your policymaker, your legislature, or your representative, or respond to some of the requests for comment. These actually come out quite frequently on proposed regulation or legislation, much of which affects how software is built, consumed, or bought. Those are really, really important opportunities, especially if you're a security expert who can do so, to provide your feedback and expertise on those things. And then also, if you're part of a bigger open source project, like, take some time and help them actually adopt something like SigStore. It will help the developers and maintainers of SigStore in that it will be easier for others to consume their software with those security attestations, and it will also help other people consume them who are looking for or requiring those type of attestations going forward. Now, I said at the beginning of the talk that security of open source is very much a team sport, and we're so dependent on it, and it's so interwoven into every experience that we've got, every device that we use, and everything that we really do on a day-to-day basis. This is absolutely essential that we make progress on this as an industry and as a broader community to have a more trustworthy future for all of us, period. And I believe that we'll only be successful with that if we start with and focus on empowering the developers to build those projects that we depend on more securely. That's going to include the education, the tooling, the participation, the funding, the time, the other resources. But effectively having all that broader contribution and collaboration across not just the consumers of open source, but the producers of that, coming together and having the teams where each person is playing their part, their position on the field to make sure that we've got an opportunity to win in this space. And it's easy for me certainly to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at GitHub, and obviously we're in a unique position to have an impact, but I hope that when you leave here today, you'll think through, like, what's the dependency that I have or that my team has on open source, and look at some of the opportunities that we talked about to get involved. So thanks for your time today. We've got a little bit of time for questions if you want to walk up to the microphone and state your question in the microphone to make sure that everybody can hear it and that it gets picked up on the recording.
Something said towards the end with open source program office. Any best practice you can recommend to folks to set up that up? Anything, any frameworks, anything they can leverage to build the program office? I know I hear that a lot now with customers that want to do that. I'm just curious, any thoughts?
Yeah, so the question, if I can restate that, and thanks for the question. The question was basically, like, how do you know how to set up something like a open source program office, which is a common term for the group inside, like, a software engineering team that manages the relationships or provides guidance on how to interact with and interface with the open source projects that you depend on, or if you have a project that you've open sourced and maintained as a company, the sort of guardrails and expectations and tooling and support for that. I mean, I'm just curious generally, like, how many of you have a open source program office at your employer? So I mean, that by itself is indication that, like, I think there's a need for this, and certainly in a lot of customer conversations that I have or when I talk to companies or developers, I think the need here for more formalized engagement and support to help people engage is critical. And actually, like, I talked a lot about Log4j, but I'll just give you an example of where I think this is painfully visible, I would say, in the broader community. I'm forgetting who actually sent the tweet, but there was a tweet sent a few days after the Log4j incident was disclosed where one of the maintainers was basically showing that a company had sent them a demand to complete a security questionnaire about their company's security practices, and demanded a response within 24 hours, I believe it was, to their inquiry about Log4j and what they were going to do to fix about it. And while I understand where that might have been coming from, I think this fundamentally represents a misunderstanding of the relationships and sort of the broader ecosystem and the interdependencies between commercial entities that make software and open source maintainers who are effectively the volunteers who have built the internet and all the major components that we rely on to build commercial experiences. So it's a suggestion that I think we have a really long way to go, and more companies can benefit from that. But there's actually quite a few resources. I mean, certainly on GitHub, we've published quite a bit of content around like how to get started with an OSPO, but that's very much, that's maybe something I could have added to the second slide there, showing more longer strategic initiatives, would definitely be that. And it can be lightweight, just on best practices on how to work with communities, but I would definitely encourage folks to look at and have best practices that are socialized in the company on how to work with and interact with open source constructively. Great question. What other questions can I answer? All right, well, hearing none, I want to thank you guys again for your time. I appreciate everybody being here today. I hope you have a great rest of the conference. I'll hang out if anybody wants to sidebar here before the next talk. But again, thanks for being here and enjoy the rest of the day.